Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Technical Assistance webinar for the Rare Diseases Clinical Research Consortia Notice of Funding Opportunity. My name is Joanne Lumsden, and I am the NCAT Scientific Program Manager for the RDCRN. Please note that during the webinar, all external lines will be muted. If you have questions, please submit them via email to ncats_rdcrn@mail.nih.gov. We will not answer questions that are specific to your application or science. Please contact one of the scientific research contacts listed in the NOFO for those questions. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Answers to questions not able to be addressed during the webinar will be provided on the NCAT's RDCRN applicant information page following the webinar. The slide deck and recording from this webinar will also be posted on the web page. Automated captions are available during this webinar by clicking the Show Captions icon on your Zoom toolbar. Please contact ncats_rdcrn@mail.nih.gov or 301-827-2746 if you require assistance. Sign language interpreting and real-time captioning services are available upon request for the June 3rd session of this webinar. Individuals requiring either of these services and/or other reasonable accommodation, please contact Chris Mora at christoper.maurer2@nih.gov or 301-827-7280 by Friday, May 24. Now I will turn the podium over to Tina Irv, the NCATS Program Director for the RDCRN.
Thank you, Joanne. My name is Tina Irv, and I work at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences in the Division of Rare Diseases Research Innovation. Today, my colleagues and I are here to talk about the Notice of Funding Opportunity titled Rare Diseases Clinical Research Consortia for the Rare Diseases Clinical Research Network. It is a U54 with clinical trial optional. The PAR number is 24-206. There are several terms that will be used throughout the presentation. They are RDCRN, the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, RDCRC, the Rare Disease Clinical Research Consortium, DMCC, Data Management and Coordinating Center, CPAG, Coalition of Patient Advocacy Groups, PAG, the Patient Advocacy Groups, NIH, the National Institutes of Health, IC, Institute or Center, PO, Program Official, PS, Project Scientist, PD, PI, Program Director, Principal Investigator. I will start with a brief history and an overview of the RDCRN program. The RDCRN was established as part of the Rare Disease Act of 2002. The language directed the NIH to establish regional centers of excellence for clinical research. The centers have been continually funded since 2003, with notices of funding opportunities occurring every 5 years. By the end of the current cycle, the RDCRN will have had 33 different consortia. Again, these slides will be available after the session. The RDCRN is a network of consortia. The RDCRC is a term for an individual consortium. For example, in the current cycle, we have Porphyria Consortium and the Urea Cycle Disorders Consortium. For the RDCRC, the investigators, patient advocacy groups, NIH representatives, and the individuals from the DMCC are assigned to the consortium and focus on the work of a specific RDCRC. The RDCRN encompasses all of the consortia and focuses on issues that are relevant to many, if not all, rare diseases. For example, challenges with recruitment, or statistical models. The PIs of each consortia are part of the RDCRN steering committee. Other members of the consortia are able to participate in a variety of working groups on a broad array of topics. Patient advocacy groups from all the consortia make up the Coalition of Patient Advocacy Groups, CPAG, with one representative from each consortium serving on the CPAG steering committee. All of the NIH program officials and project scientists are part of the RDCRN. The DMCC supports the cross-network activities. The current RDCRN is a network of 20 different consortia. Each consortia is funded by multiple NIH institutes or centers, with NCAT supporting each consortium and the other funding coming from one or more of the participating institutes and centers. The mechanism of the network is a U54. For U54 series awards, NIH staff provide oversight, coordination, or facilitation that goes substantially beyond what would normally be needed for an R series grant. Working jointly with U awardees, NIH staff act as partners to support and stimulate the research. However, NIH staff are not meant to play a dominant role, nor assume direction or primary responsibility of awardee activities. Here you can see a profile of the current RDCRN with 20 consortia, 170 patient advocacy group partners, and 10 participating NIH institutes and centers. There are 295 clinical sites in 37 states and 10 countries that study well over 200 diseases. In the current cycle, there are 80 clinical studies and 13 clinical trials that have resulted in 1,101 publications, 16,958 academic citations, and 84 policy document citations. Over the entire course of the RDCRN, there have been 12 FDA-approved products for 11 rare diseases that the RDCRN consortia have contributed to. Now that we know the history of the RDCRN, we will move on to the current Notices of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO. The QR code will lead you to the specific document. The RDCRCs are intended to advance and improve the diagnosis, management, and treatment of numerous diverse rare diseases through highly collaborative, multi-site, patient-centric, translational, and clinical research. Special emphasis will be placed on the early and timely identification of individuals with rare diseases and clinical trial readiness. For this NOFO, clinical trial readiness is the state of having validated clinical research tools and sufficient knowledge of disease natural history to design efficient clinical trials. This cycle, we have 3 new institutes participating in the RDCRN NOFO: the National Human Genome Research Institute, the National Institute on Aging, and the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders. The timeline starts with the letter of intent, which is due on July 13, 2024. The letters are optional and are due no later than 30 days prior to submission. The application due date is August 13, 2024. New and renewal applications will be accepted. All applicants are due by 5 p.m. local time of the applicant organization. Applicants are encouraged to apply early to allow adequate time to make any corrections to errors found in the application during the submission process by the due date. The scientific review will be conducted in February and will be managed by an internal NCATS review team. You will hear more later about the review process from my colleague, Marilyn Hoons-Moore. The NIH Advisory Council occurs across the months of May and June, and the dates are dependent on the specific NIH institute or center that your grant is assigned to. Start dates for the awards may also vary slightly based on the NIH institutes and centers and council dates. Who is eligible to apply? Any individual with the skills, knowledge, and resources necessary to carry out the proposed research, as the PD and PIs are invited to work with their organization to develop an application for support. Individuals from diverse backgrounds, including underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, individuals with disabilities, and women, are always encouraged to apply. Individuals should have documented experiences in conducting research on disorders that qualify as a rare disease within the definition of this NOFO. Individuals must also have demonstrated experience in managing large multi-component clinical research programs. Multiple PDPIs are allowed. The minimum effort should be at least 2.0 person months per year. If there are multiple PDPIs, each individual must meet that minimum requirement. The RDCRC PDs and PIs cannot serve as a PDPI of a project in another active RDCRC at the time of award. However, collaborations among RDCRCs are encouraged. There is a broad array of eligible organizations, including higher education institutes, nonprofit, other than institutions of higher education, for-profit organizations, local government, federal government, along with other groups. Collaboration with foreign organizations is encouraged. However, non-domestic entities are not eligible to apply. Non-domestic components of U.S. organizations are not eligible to apply. However, foreign components, as defined by the NIH Grants Policy Statement, are allowed. NIH defines a foreign component as a performance of any significant element or segment of the project outside of the United States, either by the grantee or by a researcher employed by a foreign institution, whether or not grant funds are expended. For examples of what the NIH considers foreign components, please use the link and QR code below. Applications involving the NIH intramural research program are allowed. However, NIH intramural scientists will be limited to the incremental cost required for participation. The intramural scientists may submit a separate request for intramural funding as described in detail in the NOFO. It is important that you reach out to your institute's Division of Intramural Research to clarify any rules and regulations. Extramural applications that include the collaboration with an intramural NIH scientist, no funds for support of the intramural scientist may be requested in the application. I'm now going to touch on some of the key required components for this NOFO. Each RDCRC application must indicate at least 3 different rare diseases that may share but are not limited to common pathways, mechanisms of action, organ systems, and may be defined as conditions, a particular state of being that limits, restricts something else. Disorders, abnormal physical or mental conditions or ailments. Syndromes, a group of symptoms that occur together or a condition characterized by a set of associated symptoms. Diseases, a disorder of structure or function that affects specific location is not simply a result of physical injury. Other attachments. Justification for rare disease status is required. The rare disease status attachment may be no more than 3 pages in length and must include all targeted diseases and conditions. In an other attachment entitled Rare Disease Status, all applicants must include a justification that the diseases conditions being studied are rare in the U.S. This section may include 1 or more references confirming that the prevalence of the disease conditions that are the primary focus of research in this application is 200,000 or fewer patients in the U.S. as defined by the Rare Disease Act of 2002. If the diseases conditions have been granted orphan status by the FDA, provide this information in the justification. If it is a rare variant or a subset of a more common condition, provide a justification for including this variant in the RDCRC. Describe the scientific basis for separating biomarker clinical outcome assessments, COA validation, for this rare variant or subset from that of the common condition. Applications missing a justification for rare disease status may be deemed incomplete and not sent forward for review. Each RDCRC must have 2 to 4 clinical research studies and have 1 natural history or longitudinal study. Research studies must all be conducted at multiple sites. However, future pilot studies may be single-site projects. Applicants are encouraged to emphasize new ideas, novel approaches, and state-of-the-art technologies to address the need for early diagnosis and effective treatments, along with other strategies to improve the lives of individuals with rare disease. Applicants with research agendas at varying stages of scientific development within the research program are encouraged to apply. This includes groups that would be considered early stage RDCRC with many knowledge gaps that need to be addressed. Examples would be groups that do not yet have established registries, groups with poorly defined natural history studies that would benefit from an RDCRC effort. RDCRN CPAG was established to promote collaboration between rare disease patient and stakeholder organizations and the RDCRN to facilitate better access to and earlier benefits from research conducted on rare diseases. Each RDCRC must form partnerships with patient advocacy groups. These groups must participate as active members of the RDCRC with meaningful roles within the RDCRC as members of the RDCRN CPAG. Single IRBs are required for all multi-site projects. Investigators are strongly encouraged to use Smart IRB and reliance agreements. You can find a link to Smart IRB below, or you can use a QR code. Applications considered not responsive to this NOFO include projects that are single-site clinical studies, are phase 3 clinical trials as part of the clinical research projects, have fewer than 3 rare diseases included, do not include at least 1 longitudinal study, have either less than 2 or more than 4 research projects submitted, has no patient advocacy group involved, include studies that are basic science, propose any type of animal studies within the RDCRC. It's important to note that the use of in vitro models must be relevant to clinical endpoints, i.e., testing of drugs, validating biomarkers versus more basic research. Investigators are allowed up to 3 cycles of support. The previous iteration of the RDCRC indicated that it is the intent of the NIH to support individual RDCRCs for no more than 3 award cycles. That is, RDCRCs that have been successfully competed for RDCRC funding with the same focus 3 times. New applications should not replicate the research project or aims of the previously funded RDCRC. The NIH will continue to support RDCRCs funded under previous, current, or future funding opportunities for no more than 3 award cycles. All new projects must address the specific interest of 1 or more NIH institute or center. Prospective applicants are strongly encouraged to consult with the scientific research contacts from the NIH early on in the preparation of the application. Now a little bit about the cores and the projects. There are 4 primary components of the RDCRC. I will go through each section, including the overall section, the administrative core, the pilot feasibility governance core, the career enhancement core, and the research projects. For the application, there will be an overall section. Each RDCRC must address specific unmet clinical research needs that will move the field of research forward from its current state of knowledge. This includes activities such as earlier diagnosis of individuals with targeted rare diseases and facilitating more rapid development of treatments through a program in clinical trial readiness. Specific aims for this overall section should describe the overall goals of the RDCRC for the performance period of the grant. Describe the research objectives of the RDCRC for promoting understanding of rare diseases, facilitating early and timely diagnosis, and establishing clinical trial readiness. Research strategy should describe the major theme of the RDCRC, its goals and objectives, background information, the overall importance of the research, and provide a sense of the overall significance of the RDCRC. For example, how the RDCRC infrastructure and any results and resources it generates will impact and encompass rare diseases in the near and long term if the goals and objectives are achieved. The administrative core of each RDCRC will be responsible for the following activities: administrative support for the RDCRC, management of the RDCRC agreements and regulatory and clinical documentation, coordination of activities with the DMCC, management and sharing of data and biospecimens, collaborating with the DMCC in the engagement and dissemination of information, and coordination of patient advocacy groups. The personnel of the administrative core should include the principal investigator. This should be an individual with a demonstrated experience in the management of multi-site clinical research programs, along with conducting rare disease research. Should also be an administrative coordinator. This is an individual with appropriate skills and experience to assist the RDCRC program director and the administrative core PI, along with the day-to-day administrative details and program coordination. There should also be identified statistical and bioinformatics team members to work collaboratively with the DMCC. The biostatistician should be an individual with demonstrated strong statistical experience working with rare disease research as well as clinical trial design and implementation. The bioinformatics staff should be an individual with demonstrated skill in managing RDCRN established data standards, FAIR data principles, and biological data, especially when the data sets are small and complex. The administrative core is responsible for the overall management of day-to-day program activities for the RDCRC. Clear policies and procedures for the consortia should be established for the RDCRC that dovetail with those of the RDCRN. Administrative core is responsible for coordination of patient advocacy group involvement across the RDCRC activities, and the administrative core will also serve as a primary touch point for coordinating collaborations with the DMCC. The administrative core is responsible for the coordination and management of the RDCRC agreements that regulate RDCRC activities. The administrative core will also coordinate and manage all regulatory and clinical documents in collaboration with the NIH and the DMCC. The administrative core will be responsible for coordinating the required single IRB. It is important that the RDCRC is prepared to identify a point of contact and communication with the DMCC. The RDCRC must not replicate services provided by the DMCC. The administrative core will coordinate data sharing and biospecimen sharing, storage, and tracking information across all clinical sites within the RDCRC and externally with appropriate agreements. This is not a physical repository, but an index of information. The DMCC will provide resources for tracking specimens and via a virtual repository indexing biospecimens. Outreach beyond academic activities is expected, and this may include, but is not limited to, dissemination through social media, information and education for the patient community, and collaboration with the patient advocacy groups and the DMCC. The RDCRC will collaborate with the DMCC to create and manage an RDCRC specific website. Purpose of the pilot cores are to enable future pilot studies and advance the diagnosis, clinical trial readiness management, and/or treatment of rare diseases. They may be single or multi-site projects. They may be awarded to institutions that are not already RDCRC members and may require a subaward. Specific pilot feasibility projects must not be described. A plan for how pilots will be selected and how results will be disseminated must be included. Pilot projects may be clinical trials only with prior NIH institutional approval. Policies may vary by institute. The selection and initiation of pilot feasibility projects are contingent upon approval by the administering NIH institute and are subject to NIH clinical research regulations. The purpose of the Career Enhancement Corps is to play a leadership role in career enhancement for the next generation of researchers. It's to attract researchers to the rare disease research field, foster diversity, equity, inclusivity, and accessibility to research, and contribute to the development of future research leaders. Examples of career enhancement candidates included, but are not limited to, the following: doctoral and medical students, postdoctoral fellow, researchers, clinical fellows, early stage investigators, and investigators new to the rare disease field. Leveraging existing programs and exploring fellowship opportunities from other public and private funding organizations is encouraged. Propose projects that expand the career enhancement environment, and exposure to research at RDCRCs is also encouraged. A minimum of 2, but no more than 4 multi-site clinical research projects are required. One of the projects must be longitudinal in nature, with the intent of understanding the clinical course of the disease and helping inform future clinical trials. Each of the proposed clinical research projects should address problems that require a substantial collaborative research effort, as well as a multi-site RDCRC environment to solve, and can benefit from NIH programmatic input. The research project should be more substantial than what can be accomplished in a single project. Any clinical trials proposed as part of the RDCRC must meet ICO-specific rules for clinical trials. Consultation with relevant ICO contact prior to proposing a clinical trial is highly encouraged. Such clinical trials should be designed to provide specific data that will be necessary to design a subsequent definitive efficacy trial. The proposed clinical trial must address questions that, when answered, will optimize the design of a subsequent definitive clinical trial rather than simply address the clinical question with lower power. The use of in vitro models must be relevant to clinical endpoints. For example, testing drugs, validating biomarker versus more basic research. Now we will move on to the Data Management and Coordinating Center. Overall, the goal of the DMCC is to provide support to each individual RDCRC and to coordinate and support the activities of the RDCRN as a whole. The DMCC will support the consortia by maintaining a robust, secure data infrastructure for the RDCRN. The DMCC cores in their grant include administrative core to facilitate network operations, governance, and communications, a data management core to build and maintain a robust, secure data structure, clinical research core to provide guidance in developing best practices in clinical research protocol development and good data practices using the FAIR principles, engagement and dissemination core to promote patient engagement and broad research dissemination. It is imperative that the RDCRC applicants carefully review the DMCC NOFO to fully understand the resources and services that will be provided to the network participants by the DMCC. The QR code on the slide will lead you to the DMCC RFA. The RDCRC participants are required to work collaboratively within the RDCRN DMCC cloud environment and to ultimately share their data within the RDCRN data repository. The RDCRC must not replicate services provided by the DMCC. The RDCRCs will collaborate with the DMCC to establish and promulgate coordinated RDCRN data management and data sharing standard policies within the RDCRC. The DMCC will provide a management system for collection, storage, and quality control of clinical research data, including a web-based platform that allows for real-time tracking of data quality and completeness that facilitates remote monitoring. A management system that provides a virtual repository that indexes existing biosamples and other resources within the network, a portal and tools establishing a tool garden of shared research tools for research scientists and clinicians to access and manage their own data. The tools provided by NCATS include, but are not limited to, Amazon Web Services, Altizian, CodeCOV, Facebook, GitHub, MailChimp, Pantheon, Shippo, Shutterstock, Twilio, Vimo Pro, 7bridges, and Box.com. The investigative team of the DMCC Data Management Core will manage and facilitate the use of cloud computing services and engineering support provisioned by the ITRB of NCATS. The DMCC will provide RDCRC's access to the cloud instance through the NCATS Federated Authorization Services and will have complete rights to all services provided by the cloud service provider. The DMCC will coordinate and support efforts in collaboration with representatives of the RDCRC to develop and monitor good data practices of clinical research data and will assist in facilitating the use of FAIR principles for data management. The DMCC will also facilitate coordinated data standards across the network. The RDCRN DR will serve as the central repository for the RDCRN-generated clinical research data. It will host consented research data from RDCRC-initiated natural history studies, interventional studies and trials, patient-reported outcomes, and other modalities that were obtained under RDCRN protocols. The RDCRN-DR will also function as a central indexing site for RDCRN data that may be required to reside in other NIH-based data repositories, such as the databases of genotypes and phenotypes, dbGaP, or the National Database for Autism, NDAR. Institute-specific research interests and priorities are very important. Prospective applicants are urged to consult with the scientific research contacts of the NIH early in the preparation of the application. The scientific research contacts for each of the participating institutes. Please reach out to them. They are ready and waiting. We will now change course and learn more about the scientific review process for the RDCRCs from Marilyn Moore-Hoon, the Chief of the NCATS Scientific Review Branch. Marilyn, take it away.
Morning. I will be covering the review of the applications submitted to the RDCRC funding announcement. I am Marilyn Moore-Hoon, and I am the Chief of the Scientific Review Branch at NCATS. Doctors Lourdes Ponce and Ming Yan will lead a large group comprising the RDCRC review team, which will be focused on the robust review of the RDCRC applications. Now I will move into the important aspects for the review of the RDCRC applications. Tina has already outlined the required components, but to reiterate, submitting a complete and compliant application will ensure that your application moves forward to a full scientific review. It will also inform review staff about how we will assess your application for completeness and compliance upon receipt. For instance, if the funding announcement clearly states that a minimum of 2 and maximum of 4 clinical research projects are allowed, if an application is submitted with 5 clinical research projects, it will be deemed non-compliant with the funding requirements. And likewise, if it were to be submitted with fewer than 2, so only 1 clinical research project, it would also be deemed non-compliant. Going deeper into the funding announcement, into Section 5 of the funding announcement, will give you the information and language that will be used to guide reviewers for the review of your application. For the overall application, it will be scored for the 5 major standard criteria of significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment, and then receive an overall impact score. The administrative core and the pilot feasibility core and career enhancement cores have core-specific questions for reviewers to consider. Projects will be rated similarly to the overall, being assessed on the 5 major criteria, as well as funding announcement specific questions. The funding announcement also provides an opportunity to help the review staff prepare for your incoming application through the submission of a letter of intent. Although a letter of intent is not required, it is not binding, and it does not enter into the review of a subsequent application. The information that it contains will allow the RDCRC review team to estimate the potential review workload, begin identifying areas of expertise needed, and to better plan for the review of your application. Your application will be reviewed by a special emphasis panel convened by NCATS. The assignment request form is a way for you to indicate your preferences for assignment to a specific IC for funding, or to indicate areas of scientific expertise to aid in the review of your application. Finally, before you can submit, it is important to know that you should submit as early as possible so that you can fix any errors before the due date. I've provided some links for important FAQs and information regarding submission. Note, the system will give you 2 days to fix any errors, but this does not extend past the due date. So if you submit your application on August 12th, the day before the due date, you will have only 1 day to fix errors and not 2. So now we'll get into how the RDCRC applications will be evaluated. Once the review team receives your application, we will begin with the administrative review. We will look for required components to make sure they are there, such as checking whether the justification of rare disease status document has been included to ensure it is a complete application. Going back to my earlier slides, this is why digging into the funding announcement is so important for you to have a good understanding. We will also look for compliance, such as meeting eligibility requirements or not exceeding the number of allowed clinical research projects. Finally, the application will be assessed for responsiveness by the program officers. For instance, in terms of looking at the justification for rare disease status to assess whether the diseases included are in fact a rare disease. The scientific review officers and program staff work together to determine next steps if there is a problem with an application. We will try to work within policy to provide a potential solution. However, frequently, when there is an issue with completeness, compliance, or responsiveness, it will result in the withdrawal of an application. You will receive a notification from the review team once your application has passed the administrative and responsiveness assessment, and then once again when the meeting date is set. Next, the SROs will take a deep dive into each application to assess the people and institutions involved in the application. We will look at biosketches, collaborators listed on letters of support, advisory board members, and consultants. Having a complete list of everyone involved in an application helps us to ensure conflicts of interest are managed appropriately. It is not required, but if you can index your letters of support, this is a big help for review staff. Continuing, SROs will also take a deep dive into the diseases, approaches, and goals of the application, both overall and then specifically for all of the clinical research projects and cores. So having a clear abstract and specific aims and robust methods section is again helpful to review staff and more importantly for reviewers. I will always advise applicants to think of the reviewers and make it as easy as possible for readers to know what you are doing and why you are doing it. The goal of scientific peer review is to ensure an expert, diverse, and unbiased review panel. Factors other than the science and the methodologies in your application do come into play when recruiting for reviewers. For instance, we consider conflicts of interest, the federal requirement to balance advisory committees, reviewer experience, and the breadth of expertise needed. For instance, a clinical trial may need specialized expertise. More information can be found in the webinar notes for this slide. SROs also spend a lot of time preparing funding announcement specific materials used to guide reviewers in their review. In a moment, I will be going through the review criteria specific for these RDCRC applications, and this will be a highlight of the information that we will be providing reviewers. Now, to clarify the review of applications for the RDCRC. I will go through the review of projects, followed by cores, and finally we'll cover the review of the overall application. Each clinical research project will be reviewed using the standard 5 review criteria of significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. The project will receive criteria scores on a 1 to 9 scale. I won't be reading all of the exact criteria reviewers will be asked to consider, but in short, it is the standard NIH review criteria as well as additional RDCRC specific funding announcement questions. On this slide, both significance and investigator have RDCRC specific questions for reviewers to consider when assessing the projects. For instance, under investigators, does the clinical research team have the appropriate expertise in the rare disease focus for that project? Continuing with the review of the projects, assessment of both the approach and environment will again be on the standard review criteria along with RDCRC NOFO-specific questions. For instance, under approach, reviewers will be asked to consider whether the statistical analysis plans are appropriate for rare disease research. Moving on to the assessment of the administrative core. It will receive 1 score based on the 1 to 9 scale. This score will encompass assessments of the significance, the team, the communication strategies, and the approach. Again, I will not read verbatim as these bullets are copied from the funding announcement, but you can go through the slide deck or the funding announcement to read this material when you have time. Continuing with areas being assessed for the administrative core, we also have communication plans and approach. Finally, this is the continuation of the listing of the questions where reviewers will be asked to consider for the approach under the administrative core. The pilot feasibility core and career enhancement cores will be rated qualitatively using acceptable, acceptable with concerns, or unacceptable. Here is a listing of the reviewer considerations for the pilot feasibility governance core. And likewise, here is a listing of the reviewer considerations for the Career Enhancement Core. You will note that for this core, there is a specific consideration for renewal applications. Finally, the ratings for the cores and projects will be taken into consideration in assessing the overall application. For assessment of the overall impact, each application will be assessed on the standard 5 NIH criteria of significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment, the quality of the projects, and the quality of the cores. Additional criteria, such as protection of human subjects, inclusions, biohazards, and renewals, will also factor into the overall impact score. Note, despite being a U54 center mechanism, this funding announcement specifically does not use the term synergy in the announcement, as it is allowed that each project may stand alone and not synergize with the other projects, but the application as a whole should have a solid foundation for the projects and rare diseases being studied and justification for being grouped into one center. For applications submitted to the RDCRC NOFO, significance will be assessed on standard considerations as well as the considerations listed below. For instance, is there a strong rationale for grouping the 3 rare diseases together with an eye for moving the individual fields forward? Are there projects sufficiently meritorious individually to enable the proposed RDCRC Center to advance understanding of the diseases and potentially eventually facilitate advancing patient care and reducing disease burden? For the overall application, the research team should have appropriate rare disease expertise, and the PI should have expertise and experience appropriate for managing large, multi-component clinical research programs in rare diseases. Innovation will be assessed using only the standard NIH criteria questions, while for assessment of the environment, there should be sufficient institutional commitment indicated for all of the institutions and sites involved in the research program. Approach, which typically comes ahead of environment, is on the next slide. Finally, for the RDCRC, the approach should incorporate patient and stakeholder input, clear plans for collaborating with the DMCC and other RDCRC, and a strong commitment to ensure effective relationships across the RDCRN. Finally, these are large, complex, and scientifically unique applications across the spectrum of rare diseases. It takes time for a robust review process to happen. As I said, we are aiming for a January or early February 2025 review meeting. Summary statements will take a while to be processed and will be released no later than April 20th, 2025. After the review meeting, your grant folder will have your score and eventually your summary statement. Please wait to contact your program officer until after the summary statement has been released. Thank you very much for your time, and I will hand it back to Tina.
If you have general questions after the webinar, please submit them to ncats_rdcrn@mail.nih.gov. Answers to questions not addressed during the webinar will be provided on the NCATS RDCRN applicant information page, which can again be found at the QR link or at the link below. Questions that are specific to your science or application will not be answered during the webinar. Please reach out to the appropriate NIH program officer. I'd like to take a moment to thank our great team members who've made this webinar possible: Joanne Lumsden, PJ Torres, Ainley Tisdale, and Mira Shaw. Thank you all for your hard work.